Joe Biden is in, I don't know if he's right this moment in Lithuania for the NATO talks, but he is, if he's not, he's en route. One of the big issues, I think, is going to be inclusion or the inviting of Sweden in. Turkey apparently has again put up a roadblock to this. And let me be clear, I mean, just because of how, I felt that NATO had, NATO expansion was not helpful. Not necessarily that it was provocative for Russia, but it was just simply unnecessary to maintain a sort of like warlike footing. Putin did a very good job of convincing people who were NATO skeptical that there was value to the alliance, sadly. Sweden may get let in. Turkey seems to be basically trying to inhibit their inclusion so that they can get into the EU. Meanwhile, I would imagine another topic of discussion at the NATO summit will be the use of cluster bombs. And there's a whole, we'll go through all of the sort of like supposed qualifiers and mitigators, because there's a lot of them that are being deployed. No pun intended. Here is Joe Biden on with Fareed Zakaria. This was on Friday, either just as the announcement that we were going to be sending cluster bombs to Ukraine was made. And to be clear, I don't know if Biden says it specifically here, but Russia has supposedly been using cluster bombs for an extended period of time. There are only, as far as I know, something like 10 countries that did not sign the international treaty, essentially disavowing the use of cluster bombs. Russia is one of those countries. The U.S. is another one of those countries. Turkey is one of those countries. Ukraine is one of those countries. There's a couple more. I can't remember off the top of my head. And the real problem with cluster bombs is that whenever you have wars, there's a certain amount of armaments that don't explode. And so they sit there.
They're called bombettes. So it's like a bomb, and then little smaller bombs essentially get clustered, right? And they don't deploy, and they sometimes they don't blow up, I should say, but they sometimes remain dormant. And there are reports of children, particularly in Laos, which we cluster bombed the hell out of, maimed and murdered and killed years later after these bombs were dropped, because they're just left there.
Horrible for the civilian population. Much harder to sort of like find those after the fact. But here's Biden defending sending those cluster bombs.
What made you change your mind and decide to give them these weapons?
Two things, Fareed, and it was a very difficult decision on my part. And by the way, I discussed this with our allies, discussed this with our friends up on the Hill. And we're in a situation where Ukraine continues to be brutally attacked across the board by munitions, by these cluster munitions that have dud rates that are very, very low, I mean, very high, that are a danger to civilians, number one. Number two, the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. The ammunition, they call them 155 millimeter weapons. This is a war relating to munitions, and they're running out of that ammunition, and we're low on it. And so what I finally did, I took the recommendation of the Defense Department to not permanently, but to allow for, in this transition period where we get more 155 weapons, these shells for the Ukrainians, to provide them with something that has a very low dud rate. It's about I think it's 150, which is the least likely to be blowing. And it's not used in civilian areas. They're trying to get through those trenches and then stop those tanks from rolling. And so, but it was not an easy decision, and it's not. We're not signatories to that agreement, but it took me a while to be convinced to do it. But the main thing is they either have the weapon to stop the Russians now keep them from stopping the Ukrainian offensive through these areas, or they don't. And I think.
All right. So the important things to note here. The dud rate being, this is the problem with these weapons, is that if they're duds, they don't explode when they're supposed to, and they sit around, like Emma was saying before. I've read different things about whether there was going to be a waiver on the dud rate or not. And look, there are like the mitigating sort of stories that they're telling. One, that we don't have other weapons to provide them. That may or may not be the case.
Hilarious.
We don't know.
Now, I mean, that's. I mean, the United States has ample weaponry that we could be sending them. I mean, there's so much weaponry available, I would guess, but they're trying to do this because the Russians are using this against Ukrainians.
The second thing is that we're not using these in civilian areas. Well, I don't know. They're not civilian areas today. The other mitigating thing I've heard is that they're going to be used only in areas where Russia has already mined a lot of the area. So these are areas that will have to be demined anyways. They're deploying a wide array of justifications for this. Which, some could be true. Some could be partially true.
The point, though, is that this land is not a permanent war zone, we hope. The point is that these bombs could be there, could miss some sort of cleanup effort, and is likely to harm civilians in the future.
I would say also the other problem with this is, even if it is the case, it's only being used in areas that are being mined, and therefore there's going to be mine cleanup, and it's going to protect the children. Even if it is the case that there are no money and no other, this is not where civilians go. Even if it is the case, it's hard again to believe that we don't have any other armaments to give them, and there's going to be far more slaughter if we do not provide these armaments. Remember, every time the U.S., which, supposedly is the moral authority in the world, when they do this, when we do this, it opens the door for others to do it in a wider way. Now, granted, yes, Russia would do it, but there's a reason why 2 years ago, you had Jen Psaki saying that if they did deploy cluster bombs, then this is a war crime, and we're going to bring them to The Hague.
Well, Sunak, the Prime Minister of the UK, the UK is a part of the over 100 signatories of that decrying of the usage of cluster bombs. Biden just met with him yesterday or whatever, and he had to make a public statement essentially saying we'll support Ukraine in other ways. I support supporting Ukraine in other ways. I don't support this, also fanciful notion about the dud rate, which has been called into question by many experts on this front. Not sure where the Defense Department is getting this 2% figure or whatever they've tweaked. Most experts, based on what I've read, say it's much higher. It's 14, 15%.
This is where they get it. What's the lowest number we could say it is?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the way they get it.
To me, I think it's worthwhile, objecting to these sorts of escalations. But to me, it's to what end? And the point has to be to bring this conflict to an end, because I think the longer it goes on, the more these lines are going to be crossed, the more and more of them. And so that's why, the defense is one thing, but to the extent it's we're going to reclaim territories or things like that, I think we need to be very clear about what end we're actually crossing these lines which shouldn't be crossed.
And this isn't just Tanky saying this. This isn't just like whatever leftist saying this. Tim Kaine has been saying this is a questionable decision by the Biden administration. Chris Murphy spoke out, senators calling for an analysis into this and saying that this is questionable. And of course, Barbara Lee, who's consistent on this front. But like, it's not just leftists.
Let's play this clip of Barbara Lee.
Yeah, sure. Who is, on the left on this for sure, but.
So here's how the White House is trying to justify giving Ukraine cluster munitions despite the risk that they pose to civilians. Take a listen.
There is also a massive risk of civilian harm if Russian troops and tanks roll over Ukrainian positions and take more Ukrainian territory and subjugate more Ukrainian civilians because Ukraine does not have enough artillery. That is intolerable to us. This is their country they're defending. These are their citizens they're protecting. And they are motivated to use any weapon system they have.
What do you think? Do you buy that argument? What's your response?
Nice being with you, Jake. No, cluster bombs should never be used. That's crossing a line. Once you see what takes place, we know what takes place in terms of cluster bombs being very dangerous to civilians. They don't always immediately explode. Children can step on them. That's a line we should not cross. I think the president's been doing a good job managing this war, this Putin aggressive war against Ukraine, but I think that this should not happen. He had to ask for a waiver under the Foreign Assistance Act just to do it, because we have been preventing the use of cluster bombs since, I believe, 2010.
So when Putin started using cluster bombs, the Biden White House said that would potentially be a war crime. Do you think that, therefore, the U.S. government, the Biden administration, will potentially be engaging in war crimes if this goes forward?
What I think is that we would risk losing our moral leadership, because when you look at the fact that over 120 countries have signed the Convention on Cluster Munitions, saying they should never be used, they should never be used. And in fact, many of us have urged the administration to sign on to this convention. And so I'm hoping that the administration would reconsider this, because these are very dangerous bombs. They're dangerous weapons, and this is a line that I don't believe we should cross.
And before, people take this too literally, is it like, I don't know that if we have actual moral authority, okay? It'd be very hard to argue that we have actual moral authority.
It'd be nice if we acted as if we had to maintain it.
Yes, but make no mistake about it, there will be people, bad people, running countries who will cite the U.S. doing this, and you will see the backsliding. There's 100 and some odd countries doing, who have signed off the cluster bombs. I mean, you will see these deployed more because of this deployment. Period. End of story. It will be easier to do for these countries where, against domestic pressure, against the international pressure. How does the United States come out and say, Russia, you can't deploy these weapons because they're inhumane? Like, if you believe in the concept, which, I think there's an argument that people shouldn't, but in the concept of like rules of war, if you believe in the concept there can be war crimes, you don't want backsliding on these things.
I mean, the Jen Psaki statement, that was clearly not a statement of principle, but just propaganda for war aims. Right? Yes,
and our using of these will be used as propaganda for somebody else who wants to use them more. I mean, that's the way this works. It doesn't have to, Psaki didn't have to be sincere. We don't have to have real moral authority. But the fact is this is like a math problem. If we deploy these, there will be more deployed in the future. Period. Because we can justify it right now. And I think like the justification That's not the issue. The justification is, I think it is true. Russia invaded Ukraine. And then even if I was to stipulate all the other factors, the fact is that these will be deployed more in places where the justifications don't measure up with the way that people are thinking they're justified today, and it will be a function of this. So just be clear. When you support these going there, you're also supporting a hypothetical that will happen. And yes, that's part of it, because that's what happens with these actions. This was, this came up in like the torture stuff.
Yeah.
People are like, what if there's a situation where, there's a bomb, or there's a girl in a well, and this and that.
It's a 24 episode.
You can say that in that moment it's justified, but understand what comes with that. What comes with that is a green light to use these things in the future in ways that you won't like. So, I mean, that's the problem with these type of decisions, that it's not, you can come up with a narrow rationale in this moment, but understand the U.S. supposedly is the moral authority in the world. And so if the U.S. does something bad, even if it feels like it has justification, it becomes a lot easier for other people to do something bad.
Although the Laos example I gave kind of undercuts the premise of the moral authority, but the point is just that, like, at least in this particular conflict, the United States is supporting the party that has been invaded. That is the moral act. That is the within the confines of the morality of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We are on the more moral side, and that's why capitulating and engaging in these kinds of weapons of war should not be a part of the calculation here.
When country X cites their deployment of cluster bombs, they're not going to say Laos, even though it might be a better example. They're going to say this.
Oh yeah.
And that is the, but that, I mean, it's also pretty, amazing, the idea that we don't have a weapon. Like, one really wonders, like, we spend a lot of money. You'd think we would have some bombs.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, just audit.
But that's the thing, is that it goes to the profiteers, right? Like these funds, like that's because there's contract. Like the extent that there is a real lack of munitions here, it's because actually this isn't about being prepared for war. It's about greasing weapons contractors.
Yeah. X-Hamster says, Sam, not saying I agree with the cluster bombs, but the difference is that they're not being used to kill Russian civilians. That's the difference when you talk about war crimes. Well, I understand. I understand that. They're not being used to kill Russian civilians yet.
Might kill future Ukrainians.
But they might kill future Ukrainians. But the point being that, yes, you and I may see a moral difference here, but that moral difference is going to go away when someone bad does use it on civilians in the future. And that has to be part of the equation, because otherwise you're just deluding yourself.
Oh, just a reminder. Yeah, we also used cluster bombs in Iraq for 3 years.
Speaking of that moral high ground.
Speaking of that moral high ground.
I just heard a specific example in which torture might be considered morally okay. Am I listening to Sam Seder or Sam Harris? Well, that was my point, is that was the argument that Sam Harris made and completely ignored the implications for that, whatever, police department going forward. Yeah. They're going to use torture more. They're going to say, okay, well, we used it one time when it was absolutely necessary. We knew for a fact. And then we used it 2 times. So we were 1 out of 3. And then it was like we were 1 out of 5, 1 out of 10, and then it just becomes policy. That's exactly the point.
And last thing on this, it's a little bit it's discouraging, because I had been encouraged by the reports that the United States had been working on that back channel with diplomacy for Russia. and that had, like, at least that had been somewhat fruitful or something. I don't want to speak to that, but this is the wrong way, I would say, to be trending.
This is from Orwell during, I think, the Spanish Civil War. As to international agreements to limit war, they are never kept when it pays to break them. Long before the last war, the nations had agreed not to use gas, but they used it all the same. This time, they have refrained merely because gas is comparatively ineffective in a war of movement, while its use against civilian populations would be sure to provoke reprisals in kind. Against an enemy who can't hit back, e.g. the Abyssinians, it is used readily enough. War is of its nature barbarous. It is better to admit that. If we see ourselves as savages, we are some improvement is, if we see ourselves as the savages, we are some improvement is possible, or at least thinkable. So like what you were saying about the limited war or just war or whatever, that I think that is, I think it's bad that we did the cluster bombs thing, but I think like the invasion and then the desire to keep this conflict to say maybe destabilize Russia or take back Crimea, I think the perpetuance of war is, I think, the real problem.
Right. I think it's hard to argue that there is, some killing someone in one way versus killing another. I mean, the cluster bomb argument is really about not so much like how vicious and killing it is in the moment. It is that it makes it impossible or very difficult for a country that has been engaged in war to move past it once it's done. Mm-hmm. That is the argument. You're elongating the horror for a civilian population, so that like you've scarred one generation, and then the question is and this becomes just sort of like about as dehumanizing as it gets when you start to make these type of analysis. But you're not allowing a society to move on from the scars of a war if they spend the next 50, 75 years with kids coming and losing a limb or their face or dying or whatever it is. That's basically it. So. I mean, presumably, these cluster bombs are going to be used on Ukrainian soil.
Yeah. I just don't have the faith that they're going to be... I don't have faith in that 2% rate. I don't have faith that they'll be culled at a commensurate rate once the war has concluded. And it's been known that these cluster bombs kill children and civilians and maim them. So I think it's pretty easy to be in opposition to it. I'm sorry.